All right. Hello and welcome again. This is Jim Kuiper from Argonne National Laboratory. And today's webinar will be recorded so that we can provide it on the website to anybody who might want to review it later. Today we'll be talking about the IcePick Energy Zones Mapping Tool. And today's session is going to focus on some of the new capabilities that were just pushed out, and especially corridor analysis. So there's been some corridor analysis capabilities in the tool previously, and I'll be showing some of those capabilities as well as some new features that we are adding. Before that, I'll give an introduction, and I want to explain some of the unique characteristics of the tool also. Looks like we're having trouble. Okay. I'm sorry if anyone was blocked. I just enabled the larger number of participants. So hopefully people will try again. All right, so the tool was developed really and guided by the Eastern Interconnection States Planning Council, and it was a collaborative effort between three national laboratories, including Argonne National Laboratory, where I'm from, Oak Ridge National Laboratory, and the National Renewable Energy Laboratory. It includes the geographic scope is the Eastern Interconnection, so that's that blue area on the map on the right there. And there are 9 U.S. states included, as well as some Canadian provinces and some other jurisdictions that fall within that extent. And IcePick as an organization, that's the way we pronounce that acronym, by the way, it's really comprised of public utility commissioners, folks from governor's offices and state energy offices, and really government agencies and representatives. There's another organization called EIPC, a very similar acronym and name, that is comprised more of grid operators. So these two groups are unique in that they really are conversing and working together at the level of the Eastern Interconnection. Funding for this work comes from the U.S. Department of Energy Office of Electricity Delivery and Energy Reliability. And the tool is publicly available, so even though it was really guided and set up with that organization involved, with their participation, it was always intended to be a public tool, and it was launched in April 2013, or at least made available to the public at that time. And it's really a continuous development effort, so we're continually maintaining the database and adding new capabilities and that sort of thing. The main features of the site include a lot of data, mostly mapping data, models that you can run, reports that you can generate for specific areas of interest, and the searchable policy database. The scope in energy technologies is on the bottom right. It's pretty comprehensive for all major electrical generation technologies that are low or no carbon as their common characteristic. So it was really designed for energy professionals, and there's a variety of examples there. And it's been gratifying to see a lot of representatives from these stakeholder groups registering for the tool. So right now we have about 1,200 users that have registered since it was made available to the public. And I'm going to take a few minutes to talk about what's unique and valuable, because just in some recent conversations, you know, people that they haven't spent as much time with these sorts of tools as, you know, those developing them and working with them regularly, may sometimes assume that they're more similar to each other than they really are. So there's some really distinguishing characteristics of this project, and it doesn't mean that any other project is less valuable or significant. It's just that this is a fairly unique site. So we really concentrated on gathering the best available data for all these different energy resources and energy infrastructure, and really concentrated on siting factors that relate to where those projects would be located on the ground. It's more, I would say it's based on siting factors. It doesn't have as much on economic factors, for example. It doesn't have capabilities related to knowing what the current capacity of a given transmission line is. So there are other siting factors that you would need to study in other tools. However, this one has quite a bit of depth on siting factors that make projects more or less viable when you go to decide where you're going to put them. And it has robust tools. It's not just mapping, viewing data on the map, which is pretty common. There are pretty robust tools for suitability mapping for energy technologies, and as I mentioned, the corridor analysis tools, which we'll be highlighting today. We're adding automated modeling of routes so that you could generate a route with many criteria using a modeling process. Searchable policy database is integrated with the website and is pretty comprehensive. Most of these web-based mapping applications lack energy infrastructure data. That's because the best available data is commercial and it's expensive. And so it's rare to find this kind of information on the web. We're maintaining the database actively, so you can be pretty sure that the data that you're seeing on the map is not outdated. And as I mentioned, it has attracted a pretty diverse user community of energy professionals. So I'm not going to obviously go over the contents here, but this gives you a sense of the scope of the data in the tool. These are organizations or agencies, and it's broad in terms of the Department of Energy, broad in terms of the federal government data, and these other categories. So one of the unique characteristics is how many different dimensions it has. So this slide attempts to illustrate that. There are a lot of web-based mapping applications that concentrate on a particular energy technology. So for example, for biomass, one of the major ones, and this is by no means comprehensive, there's a Bioenergy Knowledge Discovery Framework. And we have some data from that effort in this tool. If you want to study biomass, you might get more depth in that application, so they complement each other. But the real benefit of this site is really that you can look at all that information together in one place and compare and contrast different energy technologies fairly easily. Here's an example of the difference between what you can get for free in terms of energy infrastructure data and what you can get commercially. So it just shows a shot of the state of Michigan, and you can see both the diagrammatic nature of the layer that you can get from FEMA, as well as how comprehensive it is at different capacities of the lines. So in the map on the right, the different colors represent different capacities of the lines. And you can see that the FEMA data only contains the red lines, which are higher capacity ones. The energy infrastructure data is also updated quarterly, so it's kept pretty current. And this is my last slide about kind of plugging the tool, but at the top, a lot of these mapping sites provide the functionality at the top where you can view information, turn layers on and off, measure distances, and some simple tools like that. And that's very useful. Many of them, pretty much every site has some unique capability or customization that's been added to it. And so few of those have the characteristics listed in the second half of the slide in blue, and I'm not aware of any other sites that have some of the tools in red. So with that, I'll be demonstrating some of the features, and if you have any questions at any time, please feel free to speak up. You can use the chat if you'd like, or else the phone lines are not muted right now. Okay, so this week we also just rolled out some new features. We're calling it version 4.0 because it's got quite a few changes and updates. So I'll just point those out, and you'll be seeing some of those in the demonstration. So at the top left there, the areas and corridors capabilities had been combined into a single button, but those are different enough now that we split those into two separate tools. Areas would be areas you sketch on the map and do an analysis, and you can create reports for them. And then corridors now will include a modeling capability, and so we pull those out separately so that you can manage them more easily. Within the corridor dialog, there are two tabs. One is a list of corridors that's kind of similar to the analysis areas. And then there's a second tab for suitability models, and I'll show you that a little bit later. There's a new action that was added to make it easier to see how you would copy a corridor and revise the route. So if you spend a lot of time sketching a corridor but you want to revise it, it's easier to make a copy of the previous one and modify it than to start from scratch. And then at the lower right of that dialog, the previous capability was really to sketch or draw a corridor on the map, and now the tool's been added to generate corridors from two different endpoints, and a model will generate a route. At the top right, there's a little bit more feedback when you launch things in the tool, so that message will pop up for a few seconds. In the case of this example, I launched a wind turbine model, and when that one completes, you'll see another message pop up that it's ready. And then at the center at the top, we added a print tool. It lets you title a map and pick a certain resolution and choose from different layouts. And then it'll create a PDF that you can use for printing or sharing. And on the table of contents, corridors are now shown in blue, and it helps distinguish them from analysis areas and make them easier to work with on the map. We also recently made quite a few data updates. Important one is that the commercial data in the tool has been extended for another year in terms of the licenses, but in order to save costs, some of the data in the tool has been removed. So the discontinued data includes energy jurisdictional data such as investor-owned utility service territories and imperiled species. It's pretty unfortunate that we won't be having the imperiled species data anymore. That added a kind of an extra environmental dimension, and we weren't able to continue hosting that. Below that, new mapping layers. We have an effort this year related to climate change and energy water types of topics. So some of those layers listed under climate change are being added. And then American Bird Conservancy data was just added. That complements the existing important bird area data from Audubon that we already had in the tool. And then at the bottom, those are some recently updated mapping layers that just illustrates how we're revisiting those and keeping those up to date. Before I get into the demo, I just want to plug the Corridor Focus team. So we have an advisory group. We have a call roughly monthly, and we're asking people to participate if they're interested in that. The real purpose is to solicit feedback on data sources, methods, and potential refinements to the planned approach for corridors. And if anybody's interested, feel free to email us at icepictools@anl.gov. And I can also provide more background about the group if you need more details. All right, with that, I'm going to shift gears and, okay, so the URL for the tools here, pretty straightforward. And if you have any comments or questions, you can always use that email address. All right. Get me to the right screen here. Okay, here's the home page, and I've already logged in, but if you hit the site, there are buttons here to log in and to register. So you can peruse the website itself without registering. The purpose of registering for the tool is because it saves your work between sessions. So if you don't things or lose them between sessions, it'll save quite a bit of your work. I'd like to also point out the help here. You can get it on the website or within the tool. There's a hard copy manual, but there's also a series of short videos. So today I'm not going to concentrate on explaining how to run the tool as much as what it does. And these videos are pretty short and sweet, and they will help you rapidly learn how to use each feature. They do need to be updated with the interface changes that we made this week, but a lot of the functionality is very straightforward and consistent throughout the tool, so I don't think it'll be a real stumbling block to have a few changes in place. Under news, any webinar announcements will always be here if you want to see when the next webinar will be, and other updates about the tool. Policy database I mentioned is here on the toolbar, and you can choose from a set of filters, click search, and that'll return policies out of a set of over 2,000 policies that have been added related to the scope that's in this project. So I've already launched the tool, and I'm just going to switch. You need to have pop-ups enabled in this website so that, for example, this opened in a new tab, and once you do that, then you'll have the reports and everything popping up smoothly. Personally, I would recommend using Chrome as your browser. It does run in other browsers. It should be pretty transparent, but we've done the most testing and work in the tool using Chrome, so it's the most likely to help you avoid any little quirks that might occur between different browsers. Okay, with that general introduction, I'm going to hone in on corridor analysis because it's a little detailed and takes a while to explain. I just want you to get a sense of the depth of what you can do and how it works. So, centered on Iowa, the tool normally opens with a pretty blank map and zoomed out to the whole eastern interconnection. So all I've done really is zoomed into this general region. And I'm going to kind of set up the premise here by looking at some data on the map. So let's start with, we can filter on wind. This is the data, the mapping library. And so I found about 12 layers related to wind. And U.S. Geological Survey published wind turbine data with quite a bit of information attached. So here's a map of existing wind turbines. FAA has a database of tower permits, and we've filtered out the what they call windmills in that data set, but just wind turbines. And the unique thing about that data set is it includes planned, not really planned, but towers in different phases of the permitting process. But what you can see there is wind turbines that are being considered, at least to the point of seeking a permit. So you can see quite a bit is happening with wind energy in this region. If I turn off the FAA, You can see there's some, large wind farms in Iowa, and then there's some gaps. Well, one of the things the tool provides is a set of energy models. So I'm not going to go into those today, but I'm going to display the results of one of those models. And if let's see, I want the power plant model here for land-based wind turbines that are 100 meters in height. Now I'll make it a little transparent. And I can take different layers and change the drawing order if they're obscuring each other. So I'm going to be concentrating in this area, but you can see that there's this sort of band of lower suitability. Red is highly suitable, and this map contains a whole series of different siting factors, all being computed together into a composite score. So for example, those black dots would be airports or urban areas, and the model indicates that those are unsuitable, so those show as low suitability. And then areas that have good capacity factor for wind and they're close to transmission lines and other factors would be highly suitable. So now I also ran a model. This model takes into account distance to transmission. I ran a second version of it without, I have to find it here, without transmission. And I'm going to make a few adjustments here. Okay, it's maybe hard to see, but let me just kind of toggle them. So if you look here in this area and by Spencer, you can see that there's that band of lower suitability. And I want to point out that that doesn't get into the capacity of the lines and how loaded they are, how much of the capacity is already being taken in by existing grid activities. But the point is, it's physically distant from existing transmission lines. Now if I take in the, I'm going to try to keep the map pretty clean here. Some of the energy infrastructure data. So I'm filtering on transmission, and I'm going to put the existing transmission lines on in the planned. Okay, so if I look at the fairly large capacity transmission lines where blue is the lowest capacity on the map, there's a pretty large gap in this region. And then if I take a look at planned transmission lines, it's interesting that they are considering upgrades in that region. I'm no expert on these projects. I'm just looking at the map here. But I can use the Identify tool and click on this, and I can get a bit of information about that. So it looks like ITC Midwest LLC is considering a line in that area, and this database doesn't tell me the status of that project, but it does say that they're considering a transmission line in that area, and that there's been some information published about that in some way that Platts was able to gather. So, so the premise, okay, is that in order for new wind to be available in this area, we might want to increase the transmission lines. And so how could we plan a good location for that transmission line? Are there any issues with that line on the map there in terms of suitability? It's somewhat diagrammatic. It's nice to have straight transmission lines because it's more expensive each time you change the direction of a transmission line versus going straight, but sometimes there are other features to be avoided. So this tool provides quite a few capabilities in letting you study that. All right, so I've already taken a few steps, and so I've got my corridors turned on in the table of contents, and here's the corridor tools dialog. So I've got a whole series of lines that I've pre-planned for this demo. First one being just to sketch that line there. If I click the zoom icon, it'll zoom me into the area rapidly. So that's just really that same straight line. Yeah, so if I have that sketched on the map, the way I would put that in is I would go to New Corridor and click Draw. So I've done that already. And then typically what I would do next is run a corridor report. So that's this third action. If I click that, I can select from a list of reports, here's the corridor report, and launch that. I'll launch it, but you see at the top right it's giving me that status update that it's successfully launched. And then under results, you can see it running here with the hourglass. That means it's running. When it has the green checkbox, that means it's completed successfully. Okay, so that created a corridor report. So if I click on that, it opens up in another tab. And this is just that straight line conceptual route, but this is the quick screen of what might be occurring along that route. And the contents of this report were decided on and designed by folks that thought about what would be the most important sighting factors at this screening level, and this report gives them to you rapidly. All right, well, first thing we have here at milepost 40, basically 48, is Emmetsburg is a populated place. So I'm not sure I want to go straight through Emmetsburg on my map. So I can zoom in and look for that, or I can add that layer to the map. So if I go to my map layer catalog, and search on that name, I can add that to the map. And here's a populated place that corridor is going through. Not sure which one. Oh. Okay. So I've got an issue with Emmetsburg. Going back to that report. So here, kind of at the same range, we're seeing high population count on the map, and then here's that other, city a little farther down the line. So scrolling down the, that's a possible issue with sighting. We've got these elevation profiles, so you can check those for steep slopes and kind of see the overall profile of the line. Each section of that contains, the maximum slope and the average slope. This is obviously a fairly flat area, but here we're crossing a river valley, so that might have a steep bank. And then we have a table here, again by milepost range, that gives us the maximum slope encountered. So toward the end of the line we have a little bit of a steep slope going on. Okay, so the point is that I can screen some of these features, and where I see things that are more significant, like, okay, there's some large rivers. The Des Moines River here I'm crossing. Where's that? So I can look here, NHD plus, surface water flow. Go to the mapping library. And these are highlighted by the flow in the river, so the darker blue Those are large rivers that have a lot of flow. So, here's an area that we'd probably want to concentrate, take a closer look at that to see what, if there are any better routes to get through there. Having looked at some of those features, and there's some others that I can add to the map, but the general concept there, where you would look at the report, find layers, and see how they would impact your route. So I'm going to add a few more that came into play without too much detail here. So protected lands had some issues. Habitat. There's some airports. The screen for airports is within 4 miles of the center line. So I'm just changing the drawing order right now. What you can do is click on the title of the layer and drag it. So some of our polygon fills will be in the bottom of the map, and then the others will be on top. Okay. So what I can do with corridors now is I can take this conceptual route and click this action, copy and modify this corridor, and it snaps to the corridor location because it may not have been on the map, just kind of ensuring that the thing you're editing is visible. And then before I close this, I can make adjustments to the line. So you can see this, maybe you can't, but there's a little dot there. And if I drag that, I can change the route, and then I get new handles, and I can just revise the route interactively. So I'm not going to take the time to really go around all these spots live, but that's the point. Okay, so I'm just going to call this delete me because I didn't really spend much time with it. So in an earlier, before the demo, I spent a little bit more care in that line. And so I'm going to turn off the conceptual one and then show the new line. And what I've done there is manually adjust the route to try to avoid the features that were identified in the corridor report. So if we pan along the route, there's some, well, let me put protected lands on top of habitat. You can see these oranges are a little bit higher protected lands than the yellow, and the color scheme is the same for both habitat and protected lands. So blended, you've got some issues there. So at this point, I don't really know what this protected land is, but it looks like there's an opportunity to avoid it here. And then there's an airfield here and a river crossing. So all I'm doing is trying to adjust my route to try to address some of these features. And here I'm going north to try to avoid this airport and this urban area to end up in the same general location. So once I've done that, I can run a corridor report for that in the same way, which I did previously as well. So I'm going to open up that corridor report out of results. I'm just trying to make this a little easier to see. So here, the extent that the report was run on is listed in the extent column. So here's my adjusted manually, and it's the corridor report. So I click that one. I'm just going to drag that to the right. So this tab has the first report, and this tab has the second report. So in the first report, I've got an intersection with Emmetsburg. And the second one, I have avoided all the populated places in that layer. So that reduced one of the sighting factors. Now, of course, there's some interpretation involved. There may be some reason to go through one of these areas, so you need to, it's not just trying to correct these things in the report, but thinking about why you would do that and how it changes the suitability. Under population, you can see there's that higher population at 45 and a little bit of a spike at 70. And here, overall, the total is 114. Here's 527. So we've dramatically reduced the amount of, the population density along the route. Okay, skipping down, let's look at the slope table. Okay, so here it's more maximum slope. There's a 10. There's a 9 here. I didn't really improve the slope too much because I didn't really have that on the map when I was working, and it's hard to really avoid that. I think you get the idea. Let me go down. Here's river crossings. Really not going to avoid them so much as maybe pick a good crossing location. Water bodies probably could be avoided. So let's see. Water bodies, no large water bodies were crossed by the second corridor. And then if I skip down to airports, okay, we've got 5 here and 5 there as well, but this is a 4-mile screen, and I didn't try to avoid them that far. Most of these are fairly small. They're heliports or small airports. And then at the bottom is a protected lands and habitat section. You can study that at this level. So in this example, the first example, the crossings are 23%, 19, and 1.42. And here, the crossings are a much smaller percentage of the corridor area in each milepost range. So I've really reduced the number of protected lands I'm crossing, as well as the same pattern in habitat if you were to really dig into those numbers. I can also run a detailed report about those two environmental layers from my corridor. So if I were to go to the first one, I can launch a protected land report. Oops. And a habitat report. So those are running. The point is that this provides a much deeper list of information about protected lands along that first route. So here it's checking the protected areas database. And here are the names of the 3 protected lands that are within that corridor. It also has 2 ranges around it that we can ignore for this example. But you might want to look at things that are close to the corridor, and you can do it that way. So for example, this red area, Steel Prairie State Preserve, is it's a pretty highly protected area. So it's not in the corridor, but it's within 25 miles. So it's looking at the Conservation Easement Database and several others. So scenic byways, another example of something you would generally avoid with the transmission line if you could. Same thing, habitat report. What's happening there is these layers on the map are composites, and we have documentation on what they contain, but the habitat layer is a composite of over 70 different data sets for habitat, and protected lands is, I think, 7 or 8, but the 2 of the 8 are very large national layers that have lots of protected land details in them. So not only do I get this general composite and, an assessment of how significant those sensitivities are, but I can actually go in and identify by name certain protected lands that I need to be aware of. And as before, I can also go to those layers. So here's the National Conservation Easement Database. The ones that are in that report would be, intersecting the corridor, and you could find them on the map. Okay, so this is the tool that has been present in the tool for a while. It's a descriptive and a manual process where you sketch the route yourself based on some information, maybe a planned transmission line out of a layer, maybe just something you wanted to study. Incidentally, there are pipelines in the system as well, so if you want to look at the Keystone Pipeline route, for example, you can check that and see what the tool tells you about siting factors along that. But the point is that I had to sketch and I had to look at all kinds of information on the map to try to judge where I want to move that corridor. And that can be tedious and it can be overwhelming to look at all those siting factors. So another way to do it is a multi-criteria analysis and using a model to do that. So I had shown the wind model, and as you know, all the siting factors that were in the model get compiled into a composite score. So what we've added is the ability to do that with corridors. So I'm going to clean up a lot of the layers on the map here in a minute. I'll switch gears to corridor routing. All right. Oops. So if we turn this one off, let's go back to our conceptual one. Okay, so we're still looking at this location, and under the corridor tool, there's the suitabilities model section. And this is really just to run the models. So we're trying to come up with some default models that are useful and helpful. But a lot of times the siting factors are very subjective and depend on your bias and your perspective. There's lots of strategies. So this example here shows 3 different overall strategies. One is that, in putting this transmission line, connecting this, we want to see if we can follow any existing transmission lines that are out there. We might upgrade those lines or take advantage of an existing right-of-way. So we have a model that considers those siting factors. And if you click the gear icon, you can see there's a whole slew of siting factors in here. And it is it's favoring transmission. It's a little higher weight in the model, and it's trying to, if you go into the siting factors for that, you'll see that being close to transmission line is highly suitable in the parameters. But it's still taking into account all these other factors. They're just not weighted as strongly. Alternatively, I might want to say, well, what about the built environment? Why don't I try to follow roads, because there's a right-of-way there. I could probably site my transmission line along the road. Another person might want to say, oh no, let's avoid roads. I don't want to see the transmission line. So the different perspectives there. And then the third model there is kind of a balance. It doesn't favor roads or transmission lines, but it has the same overall siting factors. So I won't get into all those weights, but my point is that as you do this, you would probably run this with lots of different alternatives, see what routes are generated and what their advantages are, and it can help you quickly discover, maybe a route that avoids a lot of the sighting factors that you would have a hard time avoiding with a manual approach. Okay, so if we just take a look, I've run these models, and let's see if we look at the corridor model. Here's the general model. So the reds and oranges are higher suitability, and blacks and blues are prohibitive to a corridor. So here's that urban area. This model's going to avoid that, and you can see some of these lines are pretty highly suitable. It's going to try to snap to those if it can get from the beginning to the end point. Okay, so that's the suitability surface that the model will use, and you would adjust your sighting factors and create one of these surfaces as a basis for the route to select one area over another as it tries to connect the dots. Then I go back to the corridors tab, and I pick generate from endpoints, and all I need to do is click the beginning and the end. It's going to prompt me for a name, and here are the three models that I've run. So I pick one of those, and when I click Save, it launches the generation algorithm, and you can watch, and here it is running. You can see how it progresses and when it finishes. Okay, so I'm just going to ignore that because I already ran that, and I'm going to turn off the first, turn off the test, and then show you some of these. Okay, so if we want to favor transmission, here's the route that it came up with. Fairly similar to the original route, but you can see it's going around some of those urban areas and things like that. By the way, the map in the background is not the map that this route used. So let me turn it off a second. The second run I did was to favor roads, and that was kind of crazy. That it's only using major roads, so it's discounting any of these kind of local roads, which probably isn't that helpful. And it came up with a pretty unrealistic route to get between those 2 points. What that really means is that I need to adjust my sighting factors in the model and think about my assumptions that went into it, rather than just saying I don't want to favor roads. It may be that I need to adjust those assumptions. And then finally there's a balance model, and I'll turn the first two off and turn the surface back on. So this surface is now matching, and you can see that it's following the higher suitability areas and avoiding the lower suitability ones as it generates that route. Now, no one's going to want to put a transmission line with those fine-grade turns in it, so there's some limitations to this approach as well. But certainly it'll get you to think about, okay, does it really make sense to go that far north or south of my line for those particular sighting factors? So what it really is a means of generating alternatives and studying them. And then I can run a corridor report again on that one and see how does that compare to the one that I did manually. So it really complements the manual process, and you can blend them by taking this route and editing it and taking out some of the turns maybe, and seeing if your edits caused it to hit any problem areas, or whether you come up with a route that's fairly viable. This is kind of at a beta stage. We're still testing and fixing bugs, so I've got it enabled for my session here, but you'll see that tab is locked. The suitability model tab is locked here at the moment, and generating a corridor from endpoints is locked. We should be able to turn that on fairly soon, but we had so many other updates we wanted to make in the tool, and we pushed those out, and I'm showing you the tools that you'll be able to use very shortly. Okay, got about 10 minutes left with the time we had planned. I'd like to just pause a minute, and if anybody has any questions, please chime in by chat or by phone. And if there are no questions, I'll show another example of some corridors I generated that illustrate another area. But are there any questions at this point? Oops, that was me. Okay. All right, so I will shift gears. And one of the focuses, foci, I guess, of the corridor work is really focused on national trails in terms of it being a federal government activity and that being a fairly difficult siting factor. Looks like somebody's raising their hand. Feel free to just use your phone or type a chat message. I don't think the phones are muted. Let me make sure.
All guests have been unmuted.
Okay. I guess I didn't get any question, but it sounded like somebody wanted to ask one. Okay, so I chose an area, so if I zoom out a little bit here, between Missouri and Illinois that has national trails and some major rivers. Let me show that first. Those national trails. Okay, so we've got lots of barriers along those lines. It'd probably actually be easier to see the surface water. You've got the Mississippi and what is it, the Illinois River there. So my endpoints are over here by Warrensburg and then over here by Jacksonville or close to Springfield. And in this case, if I take the existing transmission lines, you can see that there's not a lot of transmission in that area. So it's not like we're going to be able to follow an existing transmission line, and that's pretty difficult to cross the Mississippi River. So you can see that first route actually went way around St. Louis. And so let's see what happens if I favor roads. Okay, I'm still going way around south of St. Louis. What that's indicating, for one thing, is that it's not, there aren't any existing crossings here, major roads, and transmission lines, and so it's trying to use those siting criteria and ending up with a much more convoluted and indirect route. So if I turn those off, and I look at the general model, here we're not insisting on following existing transmission lines and roads, even though those are siting factors. But it is indicating that there seems to be a place near Hannibal that's a little bit more suitable. In fact, let's if we just show the surface behind there. you can see what's going on in terms of suitabilities. And then also, just to show, I mean, if I had gone a straight route, I would have crossed the National Trail 3 times here, and in this case, it's crossing it in one place. So that's an example of how that sighting factor is coming into play. In our current state of the project, we need to do quite a bit of work on fine-tuning these corridor suitability surfaces so that come up with reasonably defensible routes and don't favor any one factor too much. So secondly, I've seen that there could be a bridge here. We may need to refine our distance to roads layer. Yes. So it should have picked that as a crossing because that was much more direct. So we need to make a lot of refinements, but the important thing is that those are just data dependent and parameter specific adjustments that you can make yourself in the tool, and we can continue refining them to make them quicker to hone in on a good alternative. The real takeaway is that this tool can pretty rapidly help you analyze a lot of sighting factors for routing transmission lines or pipelines, and at least get you to a screening level of alternatives that you could then further study. The sighting factors, it doesn't include soils or property values, property ownership, whether a transmission line, whether the towers along a transmission line have an extra arm that could be used for another circuit. It doesn't get to that level of detail, but it does rapidly give you the ability to get a lot of information about these corridor routes. And whether you work for environmental protection, non-governmental organization, or maybe a private company, you have the access to the same tool, same data, and have a platform where you could maybe engage people about the issues about a route. I didn't show you the print tool. That was just added. Any of the maps that you have in here you can rapidly make into a PDF if you wanted to use that for an illustration. With that, point is that you could rapidly show people different corridor alternatives and use the tool for that purpose. Okay, that pretty much is the amount of time we have today. And I do see a question in the chat now. So are the routes exportable as data files? That's one of our enhancements that we are planning. It shouldn't be that difficult. We've had that with the suitability model results too, people wanting copies of that. What I will say is that if you run a route that you want to keep, you can email us and we'll send it to you. It doesn't take a lot for us to pull that out and give it to you. It takes a bit more work to get it working in the interface. So for now, they're not exportable. It is one of the top features that we plan to add as soon as we can. So thank you for that question. And I'll thank everyone for participating today and close the demonstration. And if you have any questions by chat or by phone, I'll stay on the line as long as there are any questions. But for now, I just want to thank everybody for your attention, and I hope you find the tool useful.